Hi, this is Corey Johnston, and today's lesson is we're gonna try and make it at least all the way up till the 34th verse of Mark's 4th chapter. This is the longest continuous teachings we read of in Mark. Mark's is an action-oriented gospel. It begins almost immediately with John the Baptist, who points the way, leads the way to the Savior. There's no mention of his birth or upbringing. It just begins when he comes on the scene as a 30-year-old in his public ministry. And there's a lot of emphasis on healing throughout the 3 chapters which precede it. He heals many. He heals paralyzed people. He heals Simon Peter, his most eventually his most trusted disciple. His mother-in-law, Peter, was married. He was called as a married man and remained as he was throughout the calling. And then we read that he forgives. In the 2nd chapter, we read that he heals a paralytic and forgives him in his own name. So a crowd of critics accuse him of blasphemy. And then on towards the tail end of the 2nd chapter, we read of something he did fishy on the Sabbath. There were a lot of rules that weren't really scriptural. They were just the result of man-made tradition at this point, which governed what the Jews could and could not do at the Sabbath. Then we witnessing him healing on the Sabbath in the synagogue on the very Sabbath day, much to the consternation of the Pharisees. And so there's not a whole lot. They don't record a lot of his sermons or teachings. It's an action-oriented. It describes his interactions with others, his confrontations, and dialogues do emerge in the context, such as in the beginning in the 23rd verse of the 3rd chapter. This has its equivalent in Matthew 12 and Luke 11. When he smears, he performs exorcisms, so those who are unable to do it smear him out of their jealousy for casting out demons by the power of Beelzebub or Satan, and he exposes the logical fallacy of his argument. And then this trajectory, which comes after it, follows a similar pattern to what we read in Luke, where he blesses those who obey his word as more valuable to him than the mother and the brother that they are praising in his company. And so the 4th chapter begins, and he began to teach again in the sea, and a large crowd was gathered to him, so that he entered into a boat to sit in the sea, and all the crowd was on the land facing the sea. The sea would have been the Galilean Sea. That was the sea. That was the northern district of the Roman province of Palestine, which bordered around a sea. And the pulpit he would have been preaching from would have been a boat. And why? Because he had attracted such a large crowd that he didn't want all these people pressing up against him. So he preaches them from a distance. He didn't have a pulpit to preach from, but he's preaching from the pulpit of a boat, and the crowd is on the land, and he is within earshot on the sea in the boat. And he taught them much in parables, and he said to them in his teachings. Now, parables are one method of teaching. There was in common circulation amongst the rabbis. They seldom taught not in parables. A parable is an instructive illustration which uses relatable experiences and events to communicate as images to symbolically convey spiritually significant truths. And the reason he had become to rely on them at this point, because by the 34th verse we read, without a parable he did not teach to them at this point, is because the opposition had mounted sufficiently against him. And this teaching method allowed him to keep many of the parables, the meanings hidden from his critics, who would use anything he said against him, anything he would say can and would be used against him. And so what the parables, now there are a variety of parables. The first one we read is symbolic and allegorical, and it has to be explained. So we're just going to read the parable, then read without commenting on it until we read the master's explanation, because we personally have no way of knowing what the symbolism conveys without the interpretation. And so the 3rd through the 8th verses read, "Listen, see, a sower went out to sow. And it came to be, as he sowed, some fell by the waysides, and the birds of the heavens came and devoured it. And another fell on rocky places where it had not much soil, and immediately it sprang up, because it had no depth of soil. But when the sun was up, it was scorched, and because it had no roots, it withered away. And other fell among thorns, and the thorns grew up and choked it, and yielded no crop. And others fell on good soil, and yielded a crop that came up, grew and yielded a crop, some 30-fold, and some 60, and some 100. So he's using a familiar and relatable scene of a farmer sowing seed, and there are 4 types of seed that have 4 different outcomes. The seed is the same, but the soil, which is analogous to the heart which receives the seed, is symbolic of the word of Elohim, as we read. The soil is the heart which receives it. And so the outcome depends on the outlook. So there are 4 different outcomes described. We're going to comment on them in greater detail and also elaborate on more fully on the interpretation we just gave in light of the master's interpretation himself. 9th verse, he says, "And he said to them, he who has ears to hear, let him hear." In other words, what he's about to say is important. He prefaces it with a warning of its significance. If you have ears to hear, you should hear what I'm about to say, is another way of putting it. "And when he was alone, those about him with the 12 asked him about the parable." So he had confounded. We moved from a mass audience so much so that he's preaching from a boat to keep an appropriate distance between the sizable crowd which had gathered them. Now, if even the 12, his most intimate followers, were confused and confounded, that means 98% of the crowd at least walked out with confusion and without knowing quite what he meant. And but the disciples, they have the intimate access that the common masses lack, and he's going to make the most of it for them by explaining it to them. So we witness a smaller crowd, smaller audience, an innumerable crowd, and this is in a more private setting and private conversation. So he's teaching by dialogue. Where he preached the parable, he is now teaching in conversation, and his audience is the 12. These are the 12 most trusted men, referred to as disciples in the Gospels, but beginning in the book of Acts, henceforth elevated to the rank of apostles. "And he said to them, to you it has been given to know the secret of the kingdom of Elohim, but to those who are outside, all are done in parables." So he's telling them that he's trusting them, and he's privileging them, and he's blessing them to know the secrets of the reign of Elohim. That's more literally translated as mystery. So the mysterious dimensions. Now, when he teaches about the kingdom of Elohim in this and other contexts, he does not do it as a theological lecture, but uses parables in order to separate the curious from the committed. "So that seeing they see, but do not perceive, and hearing they hear, but do not understand, lest they should turn and their sins be forgiven them." So he's appropriating a quotation from the prophet Isaiah. The spiritual blindness, which was alive in Isaiah's age, has been alive in pretty much every age since. Just the majority of the human race are spiritually blinded, and they can hear, but they don't understand the message. They don't grasp the truth. They don't discern the meaning, and they can see what it is, but they cannot gauge its significance from their current state of blindness. And if they could, they would repent, because they would intuit and discern the message and the motive of the message. "And he said to them, do you not understand this parable? How shall you understand all the parables? So not all the parables are as symbolic and cryptic as this one. The three ones we're going to try and squeeze in to read after this are pretty straightforward and almost proverbial and self-evident, but this one requires explanation. So in order to give them comprehension to what he just utters, he's going to tell them what he's about to tell them now. These then are the ones by the wayside where the word is sown, and when they hear, Satan comes immediately and takes away the word that was sown in their hearts. So the seed is not physical, but if it were, it would be the word would be a seed which could be plucked from the soil of the heart when we allow Satan to enter in there, and he does not need an invitation to enter in there. So hence we must keep our guard once we absorb and digest and grow and are nurtured by the spiritual seed. Then we have to keep constant vigilance over our enemy who roars about like a roaring lion, seeking whom he may devour, in 1 Peter 5:8. And likewise, these are the ones sown on rocky places, who when they hear the word, immediately receive it with joy. So immediate means this is their instinctive response. They recognize that it is something beneficial or positive, yet as they advance in their, as we read, as they advance in their understanding, it's going to ask them to do things that go outside their comfort zone. These are going to be known as the fair weather disciples, the short-term ones, the ones who heard the calling, embraced the calling, and turned back from the path. And they have no root in themselves, but are short-lived. Then when pressure or persecution arises because of the word, immediately they stumble. So having this word and proclaiming this word and living by this word is an automatic guarantee that you will be persecuted. It's part of the job description of the disciple, because we follow the master who is persecuted in the most extreme sense. And because this audience member, this receptor of the word, has no root in their heart, they have it's a blank slate, so they're happy to see something positive. But because the negative, the pressure and the persecution, they forsake and stumble over it. They count the cost. They suddenly come to count the cost, as we read of in Luke 14:28, and find the investment not worth the risk, worth the potential reward. And others are those sown among thorns. These are those who hear the word, and the worries of this age, and the deceit of riches, and the desires for other matters entering in, choke the word, and it become fruitless. So when we allow these divided loyalties, no man can serve two masters, because he will love the one and hate the other. So when we allow sin to enter in our heart, identified here, worries of the age, worry is identified as sinful in Matthew 6 chapter, because it distracts us from seeking first the kingdom of Elohim, and all these things shall be added to you. All these things we worry about, all our temporal comforts and material provisions, and the deceit of riches. Riches trap many people. They trick them into thinking that they are the supreme source of satisfaction, but they're in for a rude awakening when they die and they realize they can take none with them. So even if they accumulate and amass all the wealth on the earth, what good is it to gain the whole world and lose one's own soul? Matthew 16:26. And the desires for other matters, others we take it are matters that are contrary or foreign or alien to the kingdom and its advancement. These are the matters that are petty, personal, perhaps necessary, but when we prioritize that above our higher calling, then this will choke out the word, and it will have no bearing and no impact, and we will not bear fruit for the word, because we will be distracted and divided. And those sown on good soil are those who hear the word and accept it and bear fruit, some 30-fold, and some 60, and some 100. So this divides the line into four types of people who embrace the gospel to varying degrees and varying lengths and varying extents, and for the full spectrum of sincerity. The good soil is the one who has a pliable heart that is open and is thirsty and hungry for the things which satisfy and fulfill the spiritual appetites. These are those who faith cometh by hearing, and hearing the word of Elohim, Romans 14. They hear it and they accept it, and they bear fruit from having accepted it and embraced it and applied it. And the Great Commission in Matthew 28:19-20 is to make disciples. We're not to make converts, but a disciple is one who makes others. So we, like a fruitful field, we are meant to multiply and bear not just our own stock, but others who can continue the process, because we have to keep the fruit in perpetuity in order to survive throughout the generations. And it has withstood a 2,000-year assault. The church has stood a 2,000-year assault, and it is still standing strong, and it will stand all the way up until the end times, when the Messiah will return for it and claim us. And he said to them, would a lamp be brought to be put under a basket or under a bread? Is it not to be put on a lampstand? So these are rhetorical questions. This is a separate parable at this point. He's asking, what use is a lamp? A lamp's light must shine in order to be useful, and it cannot be covered or concealed or placed under a basket or under a bed. But on a lampstand, this is a location which is the most strategic physical arrangement for you to get the most out of its light. So light is not meant to be hidden, else it is no use or no value. And by the personal application, we are commanded to be the lights of the world, a city that cannot be hidden. We are called to public professions of faith and public demonstrations and witnesses. For whatever is hidden shall be revealed, and whatever has been kept secret shall come to light. We also read of this in Luke 8:17 and 12:2. So all the secrets of the world, all the mysteries of salvation and theology, whatever has been concealed for this side of the veil, this side of mortality, will eventually come to light. We will come to a greater understanding of the mysteries which perplex us in our present mortal state, but are necessary for us in order to live by faith. If we had all the answers, then no faith would be necessary. But the concealment of of everything that there is to be revealed is for a wise and splendorous purpose. If anyone has ears to hear, let him hear. So this marks another break into another parable, and he repeats himself with the same words he said in the 9th verse. So what he has to say is important. He's renewing their attention for a new parable. And this one reads, and he said to them, take heed what you hear. With the same measure you use, it shall be measured to you, and more shall be added to you who hear. So he's giving them guidelines. He's not strictly speaking of a parable, but guidelines for interpretations and applications. They are to pay close attention and carefully guard and heed what they hear, how they hear it, what they hear. They are to seek it at all times and recognize it for what it is. And whatever use we make out of it will bear fruit. Fruit by its nature bears more of the same. And so we are adding to the spread of the kingdom by making the garden of Yahweh more bountiful. For whoever possesses, to him more shall be given. But whoever does not possess, even what he possesses shall be taken away from him. So revelation demands a response, and a responsible one at that. So that is why Yahweh seldom trusts an unqualified or he doesn't call the qualified, he qualifies the called, but he doesn't trust an untrustworthy prophet with revelation that he's going to use responsibly. He expects them to tell them to whom he tells it to. So in personal revelation, we are to seek it and amass and build on the foundation, and we have to keep it growing. We have to keep it, because the minute we slow down and take a vacation from our spiritual walk, which it should be a 365-day-a-year, 24/7 gig, we're going to lose much of what we had gained if we don't keep gaining more and more in growing and progressing and maturing spiritually. And he said, the kingdom of Elohim is when a man scatters seed on the ground. So this is similar to the more cryptic and symbolic and allegorical one we read. The kingdom, the word of Elohim was likened to the seed. This time the seed is likened to the kingdom, similar but different. Then sleeps by night and rises by day, while the seed sprouts and grows. He himself does not know how. So there's a mystery about the process of growth in plant life or any other life. There's a lot we don't know. There's a lot we don't understand. But to quote Paul from 1 Corinthians 3:5, I believe, I lay the seed, Apollos waters, and Elohim gives the increase. So we don't need to know how. The ministry of conversion is not our job. We are to present the conversion message. The ministry of conversion belongs to the Spirit, and if we present it faithfully and driven in the power of the Spirit, then the other person can catch the Spirit contagiously from our words. And for the seed yields crops by itself, first the blade and then the head, and after that the completed grain in the head. This is the process of agricultural growth. You cannot plant grape seed and reap, or you cannot sow grapes and reap strawberries or any other combination. Fruit and seed always and only produces after itself. There is no evidence of transmutation and as the evolutionary theory proclaims. And when the crop is ready, immediately he puts in the sickle, because the harvest has come. So there's a time and place for everything. We read in Ecclesiastes 3, a time to reap and a time to sow. The 28th verse is the time to reap, and the 29th verse is the time to sow. So that's when the crop is ready. The sickle is a equipment of sowing or gathering, and it's because the harvest is ready to be extracted from the field. And he said, to what shall we compare the kingdom of Elohim? Or with what parable shall we present it? Like a mustard seed, which when it is sown on the ground is smaller than all the seeds of the earth. And when it is sown, it grows up and becomes greater than all plants, and forms large branches, so that the birds of the heavens are able to nest under its shades. So the principle, reduced and simplified and summarized, is from small beginnings grow great and big and monumentous things. A mustard seed of faith is what begins with a desire to believe will eventually lead into a more concrete belief. We have to want to believe, and that demands a choice, and we have to come to the conscious decision that we will give whatever limited reason. We will come to the cross as we are, imperfect, flawed, warts and alls, and from the mustard seed we offer, Yahweh will grow great and wonderful things through the submitted and surrendered soul, inasmuch as a mustard seed gives growth and birth and life to a plant far beyond the size of the seed which it comes from. And with many such parables he was speaking to them the word as they were able to hear. So as they were able to hear, he had assessed their ability to interpret, and we witnessed the progression of a symbolic parable to more straightforward, two of them interrupt, and then two dialogues about the need for interpretation, which is why I'm personally glad he's there to interpret it, because from a blank slate, I would have no idea. I would not liken the symbolism of the seed in the soil to the heart in the word. That's just that's something I, in all honesty, is beyond me without his interpretation, and we recognize him as the most authoritative interpreter of what he says, him being the source of his words and being the word himself. And he was not speaking to them without parables, and when they were alone, he explained all to his disciples. So the them we can gather were the more sizable crowds, but he kept hidden the meanings of the parables. He probably left them mystified and wondered and somewhat amazed and profound, but not illuminated as to the teaching of his meanings. But the disciples, the trusted 12, he kept in reserve, and after publicly preaching would privately teach to them the meaning of what he said, because to him were entrusted the mysteries and the secrets of the kingdom of Elohim, and those secrets are made available from them to us. So we have a responsibility, we have a role to play and a part to play and a stake to claim in the race that they began 2,000 years ago. So I hope that's why you're here. That being said, that's all the time we have for today. Thank you so much. I'm so glad you're here. I'll see you soon. Bye-bye.